is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. It's been a very long time since I last sat in this chair. In fact, I was talking to the US President last time I was here. Since when Boris Johnson has won a big majority, Brexit, it would appear, is 99.9% certain to happen on the 31st of this month at 11 p.m. And the Labour Party have got some very major questions to ask themselves. Obviously, Iran is dominating the international debate at this moment in time. That, of course, apart from what's going on in Australia, which is horrendous. And I'm going to talk at 11 o'clock to a former British ambassador to Iran. I'm going to ask ourselves a question here, because the EU are very much along the lines that we can do business with this Iranian regime. The Americans taking a very different view, some decisive action by Trump. Do you think he was right to do it? Do you condemn him for doing it? And what does Boris do? Boris, who has been on the island of Mustique for 12 days. I do think a Prime Minister should have a holiday, but 12 days, and leaving a senior civil servant to chair Cobra when we were told massive reform of the civil service was coming. So we'll talk about that at 11 o'clock. I'll talk a little bit today also about veganism, which now has a new special protected status. Will I have to be careful what I say in future about vegans, or could I be accused perhaps of being veganist? But let's start by talking about our democracy, our parliament, the way we run our country. And I would argue from the 1st of February onwards, that becomes even more important, as we're not going to be members of the European Union. There'll be far bigger areas of competence in the years to come. Because it seems to me that for parliamentary democracy to function, you have to have an effective opposition there asking pertinent questions and posing a direct electoral threat. It's a kind of competition, if you like, in politics. And I look at this Labour Party, and I have to say, I always thought that Jeremy Corbyn would be a catastrophic leader, far, far to the left of the average Labour voter. They got themselves into a terrible mess over Brexit, a policy that actually couldn't be explained in a single sentence. And they find themselves with their worst election results since 1935. And what I'm going to ask this morning is, can anyone save the Labour Party? And by that I mean, can any of the current runners and riders and others that may emerge in the next few days, can any of them get Labour into a position where it's a serious challenger at the next general election, which is likely to be in 2024? Which is a strange thought, isn't it? We've had 3 general elections and a referendum in the space of the last 5 years. We're going to be heading into relative parliamentary stability. So to talk about Labour and whether it can be saved is somebody much of whose life, I think, has been given to the Labour Party, much of it, of course, working very much hand in glove successfully with Tony Blair as his Director of Communications. Good morning and Happy New Year, Alastair Campbell.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I want to know what this 0.1% is that Brexit might not happen.
Well, I'll tell you what it is, and this will make you laugh, because under Article 50 of the treaty, the final vote on this isn't in Westminster.
Oh, right. It's got to be in the...
It's got to be in the European Parliament. And I've been looking at the timetabling.
They're sick to death of us. They've had it.
And I think, because Guy Verhofstadt before Christmas said we might vote against. Now, look, in reality, I think the European Parliament, the European institutions, I think they've accepted that we're leaving. There'll be a hell of a tussle to come in terms of trade deals and regulatory alignment and all of that. Yeah. But so that is the sort of 0.1%. Okay. Alastair, I remember you were talking to Ian Dale back at the time of the European elections in May of last year, when you confessed that you'd not voted for the party that you've supported for, I think, the whole of your adult life. You'd voted Liberal Democrat in those elections, and you got booted out of the Labour Party. How did you vote in the general election a few weeks ago?
I voted Labour.
You voted Labour?
I spent the campaign, as you know, going around the place, urging people to vote tactically. Yep. Lib Dem where they could win, Labour where they could win. Didn't work. Johnson got his majority, but I voted Labour. Keir Starmer's my MP. But it's a very, very strange race. It's interesting, though, when you were reading out your introduction and you said, is there any way that can save Labour? I tell you what popped into my mind, excuse me, was 1992, when John Major beat Neil Kinnock, and quite a surprise for a lot of people. And I can remember standing on College Green with Peter Jenkins, independent commentator, and he said, if Labour can't win in these circumstances, we have to face the possibility they might never win again. I'll never forget that.
And then 5 years later,
landslide.
Yeah.
Now, do I see the possibility of that out there at the moment? I think it's quite hard to see. But I tell you what I've sort of picked up going around the place since the election. I don't feel there's much love for Boris Johnson. I think there's a lot of concern about Boris Johnson with quite a big majority. The Labour Party, though, at the moment what we're seeing is a lot of positioning and a lot of analysis. I don't think we're seeing much in the way of the ideas and the policy narrative, because in the end, if this leadership election becomes a conversation with and for the party, and with and for particularly that element of the party that took it so far to the left, then I think there's a real danger. Possibly even a kind of existential danger.
That would mean, if there was an existential danger, if Labour stayed, as you see it, on the hard left, rather than becoming a bit more, say, social democratic, which clearly the Blair project was, is there a possibility here that if Labour cannot get their act together, that we do see another rebirth of a social democratic movement in this country?
Well, I don't know, but all I'd say is that, I want the Labour Party to be the vehicle that becomes not just a vehicle of protest against an opposition against Johnson. And, let's be honest, for the last few years, Labour didn't really oppose. As you said on Brexit, I think the problem with the Brexit policy on the end, it was, if you like, it was the lack of clarity.
Well, if you can't explain a policy in a sentence, you've got no chance. I
think people can take complicated positions, but you have to be able to explain them, and you have to be able to explain them with a sense of conviction. So I think on Brexit, the damage to Corbyn was the fact that he appeared pretty disinterested, frankly, and secondly, that he was trying to face both ways, and you can't do that. I think, though, so what happens now?
So that takes us on, doesn't it?
Right.
Because we're all going to wake up on the 1st of February, and
you're having a big party, I see.
Absolutely. Parliament Square.
You can invite me, but I won't be coming.
Parliament Square, and I tell you what, it's not going to be very political. There'll be people from across the spectrum, there'll be business people, entertainers, there'll be music, there'll be singing. All we need is Sadiq Khan's office to give us permission to do it, but I don't see any reason why they shouldn't do that. We'll do it under the Leave Means Leave umbrella. And I'm going to be there celebrating. For me, it's a victory of the little people against the establishment.
Oh, get off.
Well, if you think about it, Alastair, just a few years ago, every MP, every trade union, every big business supported EU membership. This was considered to be a fringe thing.
No, listen, I get it, but I think I'm not. Let's not revisit all the old arguments.
I wasn't going to do that, but we're going to have a party. You're very welcome to come along.
No, I could bring my bagpipes and drown you out.
But you see, this will do. That'll be great fun. But in a sense, the conversation you and I are having now gets to the heart of where are the Labour Party going to be in 6 months or a year. Because on the 1st of February, when we wake up and we've left, sure, there's a transition period, I get all of that. Does the next Labour leader, and this is the key, it seems to me, accept that Brexit's happened or campaign for us to rejoin?
No, I think the next Labour leader has to accept that it's happening, but also has to oppose. And I tell you one thing that I think went wrong if you track back to 2016. I think the force with which people like yourself and the Conservatives and large parts of the media did this kind of will of the people, and then I think the Labour Party kind of got swept along with that. And then when it actually wanted to get back to a more oppositionalist position, it found it a lot harder than it should have done. Now, in terms of where the Labour Party has to go now, I reiterate the point I made a minute ago. The conversation has to be with the public all the time. I actually think of all the things that are being said, and look, I don't have a vote because, as you say, I was kicked out.
Booted out, yeah.
Yeah. And I was glad to see, I think it's Sadiq Khan in the Sunday Times today saying that, the speed with which I was booted out compared with some of the anti-Semites who were still there.
Says a lot about what's gone wrong.
I'm afraid. Yeah. It does. But I think that if those who are now campaigning speak simply to those who kept electing Jeremy Corbyn, then I think the Labour Party's in trouble. If, however, they emerge with the character and the personality and the energy and above all the ideas that speak to the changes happening in the world. And in a sense, look, I speak as you know, we've argued about this a lot. I speak as somebody who I do think Brexit is a catastrophic error, but it's happening. And now you have to, in a sense, you have to move on to those ideas and that the area for those ideas that, frankly, you know, we've heard very, very little about from either Conservative or Labour. You know, you mentioned in your introduction, Australia. Is there really a plan on climate change coming from either of the main parties that the public can really relate to? Are there people there who've got the leadership skills to make people confront the decisions?
Okay, so does Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry, Jess Phillips, Clive Lewis, Lisa Nandy, or probably Rebecca Long-Bailey, which of those has the leadership skills to do this?
I don't know, is the honest answer. In fact, one of the nice things about not being a member is that I can look at this maybe more dispassionately. I think that I've seen things from, I think some of the things that Lisa Nandy's been saying about the decline of towns, which I know is something else that you've talked about.
Very much so.
I think she's saying some very interesting things about that. I think that Jess Phillips does have a real kind of sense of charisma and a personality, but that's not enough. It's then about the ideas. Keir Starmer is somebody who has run a big department, and I think that, you know, certainly going around the country during the election, you heard an awful lot of people saying, I couldn't elect Corbyn, but I might if it was Starmer. That is there. Again, not enough. Got to be more. I slightly worry that Keir, I understand why he's doing it. I don't know if you saw his campaign video yesterday. It's very much pitched left. Now,
because that's the membership.
That's the membership.
The Ed Miliband let in for £3 a time.
Right, and Ed Miliband, good example in terms of, you know, it's very hard to pivot once you've set a course to get elected. Then you've got to be careful you don't get trapped. And I think that, so I'd like to see somebody who's speaking to the public the whole time as well as the party. So I think, look, they're all saying, well, actually, Rebecca Long-Bailey is saying, she's saying virtually nothing at the moment. But I think that those that you mentioned, they're saying interesting things. It's obviously an incredibly important election because the question you posed right at the top of the programme, get this wrong, and the Labour Party and therefore parliamentary democracy goes into a period of real change.
Yeah, and that's right. And that's what I care about. I think it's very, very important we have a good, functioning, effective opposition. Can the Labour Party be saved? 0345 6060 973. Alastair Campbell is going to stay with me. We're trying not to talk about Brexit too much. It's very, very difficult. But it's interesting, isn't it? As Alastair Campbell says, it's happening. Gary Lineker saying it's happening. But I do wonder if someone like Keir Starmer wins, will they actually accept it? I don't know. Alastair's going to take your calls. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here exclusively on LBC, and it's 16 minutes past 10.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC, the Nigel Farage Show.
I'm in conversation with Alastair Campbell. We are talking about the Labour Party. We're asking, can it be saved? Can, by 2024, the Labour Party be unified and have a leader that can really challenge Boris Johnson at that next general election? But perhaps even more importantly, from a sort of perspective of democracy, can the Labour Party find itself in the next few months somebody that stands up at the dispatch box and holds the government of the day to account? Because that is how a parliamentary democracy is supposed to work. Now, Alastair has agreed to stay and take your questions and take your calls. So let's crack right on with this and go to Daniel from Epsom in Surrey. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Alastair. I want to know, in the future, will you rule out not trying to campaign to get us back into the EU? Because I kind of think that you made Brexit happen. What you did with New Labour and your immigration policy, you made Brexit actually happen. And I've never understood you've had the temerity to try and overturn it. You made it happen, mate.
Well, I accept that immigration was a factor, but if you wind back to when... And what you're referring to, I think, is when we weren't among those countries that put limits on the immigration from the Eastern European countries that joined the European Union. At the time, I think there was a very strong economic argument for that. I think business was certainly pushing us in that direction. But I do understand that immigration was a factor. And I think this thing about trying to overturn it, I don't accept that. I mean, Nigel and I have argued about this many, many times, not least in this studio. I didn't accept that it was undemocratic to put the final version of Brexit to the people in a referendum. I didn't accept that was undemocratic. I know that some people did. I do accept that possibly one of the reasons that Boris Johnson was able to get the majority that he did is because we, when I say we, I mean the kind of People's Vote campaign, we never really did have an answer to that, if you like, that basic democratic point. So I accept that. But look, Brexit happened for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I think you're rather overstating my powers if you think that I was responsible for it.
I wonder. Daniel, thank you for the call. I'm going to pick up on Daniel's point, actually, because there's something very interesting here that not many commentators have noticed. They talk about voters in the Midlands and the North switching straight from the Labour Party to Boris Johnson. It's not true.
No, I agree with that.
They all came through UKIP or the Brexit Party.
Well, a lot did.
Huge numbers of them. Because once you'd broken that bond with a party you'd supported all your life, and probably your grandparents had supported all their lives, once you've broken that bond once, actually the next journey becomes a little bit
Well, that's the other question,
easier.
by the way. It's really hard for Labour. Once you have decided to make that change, this idea that there are Labour voters who have suddenly voted Conservative,
it's not like that, no.
and they're going to come back, is not automatic. We've just been up to Scotland, and driving back yesterday, you're coming through all these seats that when we were in power were Labour, 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 Labour. They're now Tory, 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 Tory. You know, Crewe, Stoke, Workington. You're going through all these places. Now, getting them back is not as easy as people think. However, I do think that a lot of the promises that Boris Johnson made, and this, getting these communities rebuilt, the infrastructure projects that he talks about, they're not going to be done overnight. So it won't be straightforward. But I think we talk about the voting blocks with real patronising condescension. There's lots of reasons why people made that switch, but one of them was the feeling that the Labour Party was no longer for them, and that is the Labour Party that Corbyn was leading.
Well, and I have to say, but I do think Daniel was right. I do think immigration, that influx, was one of the first breaks that many traditional Labour Party people had. And I look at the list of runners and riders to be leader, and I don't see any of them being tough on immigration.
Well, I don't. I don't know. I think that I think it's this thing about it. It shouldn't be a southerner. It shouldn't be a man. I think the Labour Party's got to find the person. You use the word unify. It's not just about unifying the Labour tribe. It's expanding the Labour tribe. This is one of the arguments I had with the Corbynistas the whole way through. If you say not just to
because Momentum are very united, aren't they?
Well, not only that, but if your argument is not just to people like me, bugger off if you don't believe in it, but to members of the public, if you have the slightest criticism, you're a Tory, then don't be surprised if they go away and vote Tory.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So you've got to expand the tribe.
Let's move on. Let's go to Stoke Newington and speak to Keith. Good morning, Keith.
Yeah, well, good morning, gentlemen. Look, the question for me is that the Labour Party has to change its philosophy or interpretation of socialism to gain any credence at all, because people have realised that every time they've been in power since the end of the war, they've bankrupted the country. And last time, Blair and Brown not only bankrupted the country, they bankrupted the world, which means that their philosophy just doesn't work.
Keith, and I very rarely stand up and say anything in defence of Gordon Brown as Chancellor, but you can't suggest surely that the subprime crisis in America was because of Gordon Brown.
Oh, absolutely, because British banks owned American banks since before the War of Independence. And Gordon Brown, back in 2005 and 2006, could have stopped all that. But remember him talking about saving the world, etc., etc.
Oh, Flash Gordon. Yes, that's right.
Wait a minute. Two things here. The first is, as this whole discussion has been about parliamentary democracy, Tony Blair won 3 general elections, and you don't win general elections unless the country is feeling that you're taking the country in the right direction and you're doing good things for the country. So I think he did, and Gordon Brown was a big part of that. And don't often hear me say these words. I completely agree with Nigel. The financial crisis was not born in Downing Street. The Conservatives did politically a very, very good job, and I'm afraid to say that the Labour Party under Ed helped them do this job, that they pinned the whole thing on the Labour government. The Labour government, we're trying to talk about the future today, not the past, but I do think that the way that the Labour government's record has been negativised, not least by the current Labour leadership, is one of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in.
I think mistakes were made, and I think Keith, taking banking authority away from the Bank of England was a big mistake, but I can't blame them for the entire global crisis. Keith, thank you very much indeed for your call. Alastair, does it matter when it comes to picking the leader of an opposition party who will fight a general election and could become a prime minister? Does it matter how they look?
I hope not. Probably is the answer. But then you look at Boris Johnson. I mean, Boris Johnson looks pretty scruffy most of the time.
But hasn't he improved a bit in the last 6 months?
Really? And I mean, there's Keir on the telly now, and I mean, I think Keir looks the part.
Yes, he does.
But no, I think people over time.
Because the reason I ask this is because to me, one of the tests of who can be a prime minister is you ask yourself a question at the back of your mind. When they walk down the steps of an aeroplane, whether it's in Washington, D.C., do they look like somebody we're proud to say leads our country?
That does matter.
And I think it does matter. And that's why my view, I have to say, looking at the current list of runners and riders, I forget the politics, but just in terms of appearance and demeanour, I would suggest Starmer is miles ahead of the others.
He may well be, but I think that the thing is that people can get used to a leader. They don't all look the same. If you look at modern leadership, I mean, Donald Trump was unimaginable to a lot of people as American president. Angela Merkel, who I think is one of the most, I know you disagree on this, I think is a very effective leader.
Well, she was for the first decade.
She does not look like a classic modern leader. So I don't think there's a kind of identikit that we should think about. But I think one of the problems with Jeremy Corbyn, sorry to keep going on about this, I said this at the time of the leadership election way back when, is that I feared the public were never going to accept that he was a possible prime minister, and I don't think they did.
And look was part of that. Demeanour was part of that.
Yeah, but in the end it was about policy, and it was about positioning, and it was about your worldview, and people have a sense of that. And I think it was really interesting. I was telling you outside that when we were up in the Scottish Highlands yesterday, we went in to see this guy, and he was sitting there in the Scottish Highlands listening to LBC, and a guy called Stephen Munro, who works on the ferry up there, and people get a sense of other people if they kind of plug in and out of what's going on in the debate. And it's interesting, you look at the polling on the Labour leadership contenders, they're not actually that well known by the public.
No,
I think the highest is Keir Starmer, who's up in the 30s.
I mean, this Rebecca Long Bailey, who at one point appeared to be the favourite. I mean, I honestly think that most members of the public would not be able to recognise her.
Not have a clue.
Very interesting.
Now, and that, you see, so the sense is that she is being put together by the people who got behind Jeremy Corbyn to protect the Corbynista flame. Well, we just lost, I say we, the Labour Party just lost badly. And if you don't face up to the reasons for defeat, and you don't try to understand why you've been defeated, then you've got no chance.
You've got to learn lessons. No, and a great plug for LBC there from Alastair. And I have to say, over the last week, this is my first day back at work, and I've been laid up. I had an operation just after Christmas, so I've been laid up, feeling a bit sore.
What are they doing to you?
And a little bit of internal carving about. Nothing too serious. Okay. And but feeling a bit sore. And I've got to tell you, actually, as a listener, thank goodness for LBC, because I listen to presenters as aren't they brilliant? I listen to others, they drive
come on,
me.
The adverts. You have enough adverts on here without this.
I mean it. This is real democracy in action. We've got time for one more call with Alastair Campbell, and it's James in Manchester. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Nigel. Fantastic to have you back. I'm coming to your party. And good morning, Alastair.
Hello.
Pleasure to speak to you. I'll be very quick. Alastair, before the general election, you had a tremendous amount of coverage on TV and radio, including this programme. You advocated Remain, fabulous, nothing wrong with that. and you also advocated emphatically for a people's vote, which is technically a second referendum. In fact, on this programme alone, I can recall you saying on many occasions that a lot of people who voted Brexit had changed their minds and would now vote Remain. I was just wanting to ask you personally, Alastair, how do you now feel knowing that you were completely out of touch with the electorate?
Well, I don't believe I was. In that, I'll tell you why I don't believe I was. Because I actually think that one of the reasons Boris Johnson... Wait a minute.
Come on, we've got to face up to
it. Wait a minute. No,
the war is over, isn't it?
Listen, one of the reasons Boris Johnson was desperate to get this resolved in an election, not a referendum, is because I think he saw that opinion was shifting against Brexit. Now, did Labour lose the election? Yes. Was Brexit part of that? Yes. But as I say, I think it was the lack of clarity about their policy and the fact that they were dragged kicking and screaming to a position that at the end, as Nigel says, people couldn't understand. All right. So, listen, and just here's the thing about democracy. Just because you lose an argument, although Jeremy Corbyn apparently thinks that he won the argument, just because you lose an argument doesn't mean that you stop believing what you believe. Now, is Brexit happening? Yes. Is Johnson going to get his legislation through Parliament pretty damn quickly? Yes. What then follows? Do I hope that Britain emerges strong and, we've got a great future? Yes, I do. Do I have massive doubts about what's going to happen? I'm afraid I still do.
OK, Alastair, before you go, if Keir Starmer wins, can he tame momentum? Can any of these tame momentum? Or is it now such a powerful left-wing group within the Labour Party that you have to go through the sort of agony of the 80s and dealing with Millicent all over again?
I think if we have to go through all that again, then it's going to be very, very difficult. But I really think that, look, you were talking about the public and their desire to be part of this debate. I think that whoever emerges as leader has to be able to speak to the country and lead the country in a way that is freed from this sense of being actually just part of this faction or that faction. I thought Jess Phillips, when she spoke the other day, and she said, can we please at least try and move away from, are you a Blairite, are you a Corbynite? Put the labels away. Somebody has to come forward and step up, understand the scale of the challenge, oppose Johnson properly and with real vigour and real energy, put together a policy programme, a narrative, ideas for the future, build support for them in the country and worry less about the party.
It's a lot to do. Alastair Campbell, thank you for joining me this Sunday morning. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here at LBC. It is now 10:32 and time for the news with Louisa Jackson.
Iran's foreign minister says threats from Donald Trump breach international law following the killing of the country's top general Qasem Soleimani. The US president has threatened to hit Iran very fast and very hard if it retaliates. It's claimed the cost of the HS2 rail line could rise to more than £100 billion. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the government is still committed to the project, despite the warning from a new independent review. There are now 5 people in the race to become Labour's next leader. Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, is the latest to confirm his bid. LBC weather mainly cloudy for most today. Some rain or drizzle possible across southern England, with heavier rain in northern Scotland, a high of 10 degrees.
Leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show. Tweet at LBC using the hashtag #FarageOnLBC.
Can the Labour Party be saved? Alastair Campbell was trying to sort of take us back to 1992 and saying, look, it looked bleak for Labour then, but they did win in 1997 in a big, big way. But I think the parallels are very different. The Conservatives then were at the end of 18 years. They looked tired. They were desperately split, of course, over the European question. I think this mountain for Labour to climb is absolutely enormous. Far bigger in terms of numbers of seats, because, I mean, in those days, major majority was only about 21, not 80, as it is for Boris Johnson now. And I think the Labour Party has a real problem. I have to say, my conclusion is that it can't be saved. I don't think any of these people, if they become Labour leader, is going to have a serious chance of winning the general election in 2024. That is my view. And I also think if they do go out and stay hard on the left of British politics, difficult though it is under first past the post, I think there's a real chance here of a new social democratic movement trying to come through the centre. Before I get back to that, one other story that I must comment on. Lord Berkeley, who's a Labour peer, has been part of an independent review of my old favourite HS2. He now tells us it is going to cost not the original estimate of 55 to 60 billion. He reckons 108 billion is what HS2 is going to cost. And whilst cost may not be the only factor, I've been pushing for HS2 to be stopped. I believe for a long, long time you could spend a fraction of that money and improve services for millions of people across many other parts of the country. It's yet another one of those policies that I've campaigned on, that Boris Johnson started talking about during the election. So let's see, Mr. Johnson, are you actually going to have a proper, genuine review of HS2? Can we stop this madness? That's a personal view. Please text to 84850 if you strongly disagree with what I think. Maybe you think HS2 is a complete and utter saviour. I don't. And 0345 6060 973 for those of you that want to help me with this conversation. Can the Labour Party be saved? And I just don't think. I don't think it's credible. I don't think it's feasible. I think that the Remainers, whilst they might accept that Brexit has happened, will do their best to push for another extension. Remember, we are due to leave, end transition, at the end of 2020. But if we haven't got a satisfactory trade negotiation organised, or if we're not prepared to leave on WTO terms, we have by July the 1st to give notice to extend for yet another year. That'll be a huge parliamentary battle that we'll see in May or June of this year. But for now, I have to say, I am celebrating Brexit. Andy in Portsmouth says, please give us some good news. Can we celebrate our Independence Day on the 31st of January? Will there be a party in London? Yes, there will, Andy. There will. Look, Leave Means Leave, cross-party organisation, has put a bid in to Sadiq Khan's office to say we want to take Parliament Square on the 31st of January, have some staging, have some music, have some speeches, have a celebration, and of course at 11 o'clock, the precise moment at which we leave, Big Ben is going to chime, and I want to be there whatever the weather. So I'm hoping that the Mayor of London gives us permission. I see no reason why they shouldn't. Anne in Blackburn, getting back to the Labour Party, says to me on Facebook, the party is over for Labour. I could never vote Labour. There's not anything in their shop window to pull me in. Well, Anne, this is the chance, I guess, isn't it, for a new Labour leader to find something in that shop window. But, you know, it is, Anne, it is towns like Blackburn and Burnley, of course, just a few miles from you. Burnley went Conservative. So you know, they've got a lot of work to do in these areas. Barry is calling from Norwich. Good morning, Barry.
Good morning, Nigel. Yeah, I'd like to comment. It's really painful listening to the Labour Party guy you had on in a minute. I forget his name now. Alastair Campbell.
That was Alastair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's Director of Communications, and of course was kicked out of the Labour Party earlier this year. What was it about Alastair that upset you this morning?
Well, they don't seem to listen, do they? They had the worst election defeat since 1935. They got hammered. And whether they like it or not, that election was based around Brexit. Yeah, right? And who was going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn to go across to Europe, get a better deal, then bring it back and vote against it?
Barry, it was literally, when I first heard Diane Abbott explain that policy on Question Time, I could do no other than just to laugh out loud. It was so ludicrous.
It's
so
mad.
Ludicrous.
And, at the end of the day, Alastair Campbell with Donald Trump in 2016, it happened for a reason. You know, people are fed up with the political elite. Whether you like Donald Trump or not doesn't matter. He was elected in a democratic country in a democratic vote. Yeah, right. The same as what happened over here. Yeah, Brexit. It happened for a reason. You know, these people who are in the M25 bubble don't come out a little. They don't understand how real people live.
Maybe Barry. Maybe the Labour Party will wake up and smell the coffee on this.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Yeah, I listen to Alastair Campbell there. Yeah, well, you know, we've got to accept that we're leaving. Well, you should accept that in the first place. 17.4 million people voted out. You don't sell your house and then say to people you're selling it to, well, can I come back and use the vegetable in the kitchen now and again, or can I stay in the back? You leave.
Barry,
you voted to leave.
Barry, we will look back on this 3.5 year period that so many people in the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, the House of Lords, big business, parts of the media refuse to accept the greatest democratic exercise in British history. They have done so much damage to our country, damage to our economy, damage to our international standing, and I think we'll look back on this period, and many of them, I think, will hang their heads in shame.
I've got a brother who lives in Australia, and I've been speaking to him on the phone because all the fire, and they laugh at us over there. They cannot understand how
I think the
people vote.
I think the whole world's been laughing at us, Barry. But maybe they'll laugh on the other side of their faces before too long. Barry, thank you. I am off to Cornelius, who's calling from Swansea. Good morning, Cornelius.
Good morning, Nigel. Happy New Year to you, and I hope you had a decent Christmas break.
Well, I've been away from it all. And I have to say I've rather enjoyed that. Although it's fun,
good, and you deserve it, mate. You certainly deserve it.
It's fun to be back. So, can the Labour Party save themselves? Can they get over Brexit or not?
Never will. I don't think. I listened to Alastair Campbell this morning, and I honestly think he's delusional. I mean, for a man to turn around and still saying that his argument was to bring policy back to the country, and then have a second referendum, and then have a vote on whether you wanted a deal or not. And yet they're still delusional that the country voted to leave the EU in 2016. We didn't vote for any deal. We just voted to leave the EU.
Well, they're delusional.
And they're still rattling on about it.
They've been delusional, Cornelius, but more seriously, what they've done is to throw out of the window for this last 3.5 years the principle of loser's consent. You lose an election, you may not like it, but you accept it because that's how democracy works. And they've tried, all of them, they've tried to overturn that, haven't they, for the last 3.5 years?
100%. I caught the back end of the Andrew Marr show on the BBC this morning. They had Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips on. Keir Starmer is the only person in the Labour Party who's got a bit of decorum, style, education, thought, exactly, and particularly presence. If, for instance, the Labour Party won the next general election and they would have to be the Prime Minister of this country. Wow. The only person I think that should be the leader of the Labour Party but lost a seat is Caroline Flint. Mm-hmm. I think she's an excellent MP, but she lost a seat regarding Brexit, etc. And when I listen to Jess Phillips, my God above in heaven, she reminds me of Ina Sharples in the Coronation Street.
Well, I tell you what, though,
it's ridiculous,
Cornelius. I tell you what, though, she does have personality. She's a ballsy character.
Yes, I know you need somebody to have a bit of strength and power and stance to go up against Boris Johnson on the dispatch box. But, sorry, mate, can you honestly believe and think that lady could be the Prime Minister of this country if Labour won a general election?
Not really. No. I'm saying she's got personality, but that's very different to I'm not
talking about the way she looks. I'm not in the slightest. I'm on about the way she speaks. I listen to her style of debate. I listen to her points of view. I don't think they're credible. Well, I really don't. I voted Labour most of my life. I will never vote Labour.
When I say looks, Cornelius, I'm not drawing some subjective view of whether I think people are attractive or not. It's do they have
I agree.
Do they have gravitas? Do they have gravitas to lead one of the big 5 economies in the world? And that's the question I think that Labour needs to ask itself. Cornelius, thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and the time is 10:45.
The Nigel Farage Show on LBC.
And a massive issue, of course, that's going to have to be confronted by this government and indeed by the Labour opposition is what is going on with and it is a crisis with our National Health Service. Quite extraordinary figures out now showing that 11 million people have within the last year waited 3 weeks or more to see a GP. I mean, it's just beyond belief. If you've got something wrong with you, what is the point of waiting for 3 weeks or more? Now, this is something that Boris Johnson very specifically talked about in his leadership run for the Conservative Party. He said he's going to deal with it. I have to say, and this is not necessarily a wildly popular view with some, but we have a population crisis in this country. Our population is rising by nearly 500,000 every single year. Nearly 80% of the 6 million rise that we've had in the last 20 years or so has come directly as a result of government immigration policy. And this is the problem we've got. We haven't planned for this. We haven't costed for this. And I'm afraid whatever billions are being promised at election time, and indeed by this government for the health service, it is a fraction of the true cost of a massively expanding population. And this issue is not one that is going to go away. But who from Labour could take this on and could deal with it? Let's go to James, who's calling from Angel. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Good morning, welcome. So, who can save the Labour Party, James?
None of them, I think.
None of them. Well, that's rather my view, actually. I think they're so far behind. I think not just split on Brexit. Maybe that will ease a little bit. But there's a London split, isn't there? London v. the rest. Social attitudes towards immigration. I think, traditional old Labour is a long, long way away from Islington Labour.
Yeah. I mean, I think if there was a Labour Party leader who was to say, I'm going to control immigration, we would leave the European Union, I don't agree with all this identity politics, I am going to spend a bit more money than the Conservative Party, but I'm not going to kind of renationalise everything, they probably win.
They might have.
There's no one that's actually going to say that.
Well, they might have won, I think, is the way we should phrase that. But, when they're so far behind, unless Boris Johnson makes a complete mess of this, which, of course, is always possible, but, really, you would have thought the Conservatives should be in for the next 10 years, shouldn't they?
Yes, it depends whether or not Boris extends in July. That's the question.
So, James, you raise a very interesting point there, and I'm very quickly going to touch on it, because Theresa May, back in February of last year, her personal support in the country was higher, I think, than Boris's is right now. People woke up on the 30th of March, realised we hadn't left, her support fell off a cliff. Are you suggesting the same could happen to Boris?
I think it could. I do remember I kind of supported Theresa May. I didn't actually vote for her, but I wanted her to get the job done, as it were.
Yes.
And I remember you saying, well, she's not up to the job. And I did. You should have faith.
Yeah.
And I was wrong and you were right.
I took a lot. Do you know what, James? When she gave her Lancaster House speech, I was praiseworthy. Within a few months, I'd realised after the Florence speech this was all going in the wrong direction. And I criticised her and criticised her and criticised her, and I took a lot of abuse for it. But in the end, on that one, I think I was right. James, I thank you. Richard from Cheltenham says, let's hope Rebecca Wrong Daly. Now, this is the unkind nickname that is given to Rebecca Long Bailey. Wrong Daly wins. We'll have a Conservative government in for the foreseeable future. Peter from the Isle of Wight is an ex-Labour Party member. Basically, Labour and the Lib Dems were on the wrong side of Brexit. I think they were, Peter. I think they were. But how do they get on the right side? And how do they deal with the fact that 11 million people have had to wait for over 3 weeks to get a GP appointment because there is no quick, slick, easy answer to questions like that? Kathy is calling from Newcastle. Good morning, Kathy.
Good morning, Nigel, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Or Happy New Decade, Kathy. Now, that's a really exciting thought, isn't it?
Well, hopefully. But I want to ask a Brexit question, please. I've had flu since a while before Christmas, and I feel I've lost the plot.
Poor you.
So if it's something that's known, just apologies. When Theresa May brought her withdrawal agreement forward, Boris slanged it and said it was we were going to be a vassal state. Then he came back with virtually the same deal, and it was all wonderful. And you sent your supporters a list of all that was wrong with it. Now, as far as I'm aware, nothing has changed in it, but it's suddenly going to be all right.
Okay,
the fishing and all the rest of it.
It's a very, very, very fair couple of points you raised. Right, number one. So Theresa May calls the cabinet to checkers. All right, and this happens in July 2018, presents the plan. David Davis resigns pretty much on the spot. He's the Brexit secretary, feels he's been wholly undermined by Ollie Robbins. Boris waited a little bit, waited for a few days. He then resigned as Foreign Secretary. The Theresa May withdrawal agreement came before Parliament. Boris voted against it. It came before Parliament again. Boris voted against it. It came before Parliament a third time, unamended, and Boris voted for it. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then went to Brussels and came back with some changes. What were the changes? Well, the backstop had gone, meaning that the whole of the UK wasn't committed to staying part, of the customs territory, but Northern Ireland had been hived off, and in many other areas, Kathy, such as fishing, etc., it was pretty much the same, 95% the same as what Mrs May had put before Parliament, and I was very, very unhappy with it, and I still am. What's changed? Well, there were two things I wanted Boris Johnson to do. Number one was to make an absolute promise, his promise, that we would not extend Brexit beyond December 2020, and that means no extension request before July the 1st. And the second, and to me even more important point, was I wanted a promise that we would not have regulatory alignment. He made that promise at the early part of the campaign. He put it in the manifesto. He's repeated it since. Now, there is potentially a contradiction between those statements and what is in the withdrawal agreement that Monsieur Barnier wants us to sign. And I understand that, and I get that, and I've got concern about that. But, Kathy, I think we've reached the point where the country just now wants us to leave. And if we do it with a Prime Minister who's made some big promises, then he knows that if he doesn't deliver on them, there's a big price to pay.
Mm-hmm. As long as it's not Brexit in name only, just to appease people.
Well, if it turns into Brexit in name only, then Boris Johnson will have willfully deceived the British public with all of the things that he said during that general election campaign. And that would be a huge disappointment for those of us that want Brexit, a betrayal of the democratic process. And I think, just as Mrs May's support fell off a cliff, his support too would fall off a cliff. And I think he and Dominic Cummings and the others around him know it. They now have to deliver a Brexit that means we do not have political and regulatory alignment. Kathy, thank you. Going to go to Nick in Croydon. Nick, good morning.
Hello, Nigel. Morning.
Good morning. Welcome.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So, can Labour, and maybe Boris, my previous caller, thinking maybe Boris would get into some Brexit difficulties, can Labour find the figure to fight back in 24?
Not in the current bunch. No, they have to learn the reasons why they lost last time, and once they've learnt those reasons, they can start fighting back. But are the current two front people for it, Keir Starmer and Long Bailey, they're both repeating the errors of the general election.
Are they in denial, Nick? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they are. Nigel, I'm 59 years old. In my lifetime, only two Labour leaders have won general elections, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair. Mm-hmm. They're both centrists. And there's a pattern there, which if Labour don't recognise the pattern, then they're forever doomed to fail. And it's such a shame, because your opening gambit on this, which is true, democracy needs effective opposition.
Well, I feel strongly about this, yes. Yes, I really do.
We just don't have effective opposition. There's talk of Jeremy Corbyn putting down a motion urging the government to extend the transition period by 2 years. Well, are they mad? Have they just not recognised what happened?
No, Nick, I think I think you're right. I think they're going to obstruct, or be seen by the public to obstruct, a proper Brexit from happening. Yeah, we're going to get Brexit 1st of February, but I think they're going to try and extend, and I think they're going to meet, Nick, a British public that say, for goodness sake, we've had enough of this. Nick, thank you very much indeed for your call. Well, I have to say, I don't see anyone here. I don't see anyone here that can turn Labour around in the way they were turned around under first John Smith and then Tony Blair during that 1992 to 1997 period. It just simply isn't going to happen. But it is important that we have a strong opposition leader, proper parliamentary debate, and government being held to account, because that is how our system is supposed to work. Now, coming up after the news, a big growing crisis around Iran. Huge crowds gathered in Tehran this morning to mourn the military leader killed by US airstrike. Boris Johnson, he's been away for 12 days. A Cobra have been meeting, discussing all of this, with Sir Mark Sedwill, civil servant, sitting in the chair. What does Boris do now? Does he back Trump in terms of taking out this military leader and terrorist, or does he back the European Union, who take a very different view and think we can appease the Iranian regime? Let me know what you think. 0345 6060 973. You can text to 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
A great consensus emerged over Iran. It happened when President Obama was in office in the USA. He and the European Union both took the view that there was to be a deal done with Iran. They would promise to limit their work towards a nuclear program, in return for which a big financial opening up would occur. And I think there was a feeling that the Iranian regime could be contained. Since that deal was done, there have been repeated outrages, upsets across the Middle East and elsewhere, where the finger is very firmly pointed at Iran. The European Union's view, as I see it, still is one that we can contain Iran. President Trump takes a very, very different view, and so we've seen the drone strike, we've seen the taking out of General Soleimani, and huge crowds gathering in Tehran today as his coffin is going through the streets. That, by the way, does not mean that the people of Iran wholly support the regime that's been in place since 1979. I suspect there's quite a lot of opposition to it. But it does leave us in a slightly awkward position, because since 2010, we have, in many foreign policy areas, such as Iran, taken the European Union view. With Brexit, we're free to make our own decisions. And I did notice overnight Foreign Office Minister Ben Wallace saying something quite supportive of Donald Trump. Does this mean a change? Well, let's speak to somebody who knows a lot more about Iran than I do, and that's Sir Richard Dalton, the former British ambassador there. Good morning, Sir Richard.
Good morning.
As I say, I see that we are almost going to have to choose between the Emmanuel Macron approach to Iran and the Donald Trump approach to Iran. How do you see it?
That's not what Foreign Secretary Raab is doing. He's expressing sympathy for what he describes as a right of the U.S. to defend itself, but at the same time, he's endorsing the diplomatic route. Now, he has said that President Trump and Emmanuel Macron have an approach which failed in September, but which is still being held open. Now, that's good news, because we need much more of that in the present circumstances.
But you can't have it both ways with this, surely, because Emmanuel Macron clearly thinks that what Donald Trump did was wrong. Trump argues that they had sufficient intelligence to suggest that perhaps more outrages were planned, and clearly he's no intention of going back on breaking the Iran nuclear deal. At some point, doesn't Dominic Raab have to make a decision here, Sir Richard?
No, we stand up for British interests, and British interests are in securing the benefits to our security and to the region of the Middle East in the Iran nuclear deal, which the United States has willfully and illicitly broken. Now, the United States is not a good ally of the UK on many Middle Eastern issues. On some it is, on others it isn't. And the fact is we need to retain a distinctive UK policy. And the one that Mr. Raab has outlined of encouraging diplomacy, in which the Europeans are taking a lead, is the right approach. It doesn't go far enough, to my way of thinking. After all, there are no good interveners in the Middle East maelstrom at present. I don't think Iran is uniquely culpable and is the only country that needs to be contained. Saudi Arabia, UAE have engaged in a vicious war in Yemen with UK and US support. We have Israel seeking to extend illicit gains in the West Bank and Jerusalem. We have Turkey invading the north of Syria. We have a failed attempt by the West to support a rebellion in Syria. So everybody needs to stand back, and we need to go back to the fundamental lack of rules of the road on how to conduct international relations in the Middle East. Knee-jerk reactions like the killing of Soleimani have just made the world a much more dangerous place.
Let's talk a little bit about the Iranian regime itself. I mean, we've had regime change, of course, in Iraq. We've had regime change that we made happen in Libya. But, I mean, would it be fair to say that this Iranian regime have treated their own people with extraordinary brutality?
Not extraordinary brutality. Sadly, their way of ruling is very common. Think of the way China and Russia have dealt with internal dissent. Think of all the human rights defenders imprisoned in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Think of the millions suffering in Yemen as a result of the failure of the parties there to agree a way forward and external intervention. So yes, the Iranian government has a bad human rights record, and the Iranian people are the ones responsible for changing that in the long term. External interventions, other than making clear our condemnation of gross human rights abuses, is not helpful. And the fact is that although the Americans keep saying they're not interested in regime change in the United States, they have so grossly antagonized the Iranian system as a whole that the essential diplomacy which British interests require is now harder than ever. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Any minute now, the Iranians are going to declare their next move to reduce their commitments under the nuclear agreement, given the total failure of the European Union, the UK, everyone else, to get through to Iran the benefits promised in the nuclear deal. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if that walking away from the nuclear deal is much more severe than it would have been without the killing of General Soleimani.
OK, Sir Richard, thank you very much indeed. Well, Sir Richard Dalton, who does support the Iran nuclear deal, makes it clear he thinks what Donald Trump has made the world a more dangerous place. I would say this, that as the Iranians commit outrage after outrage, are we just supposed to stand idly by? I also feel that this is the regime that took over in 1979. These were the original Islamist fundamentalists. They are fanatical. And can you appease a regime that is based on fanaticism? And I think if we try and appease the Iranians, they'll take us for a ride. I believe that Trump is right to have broken that deal. I think this Iranian regime poses a real threat. I think they've used every piece of muscle they can to spread their doctrine throughout that region. They pose a threat to our shipping. We've seen this off Gibraltar and elsewhere. I think they intervene. They back Hamas. They back Hezbollah. I mean, goodness me, whatever we think about Gaddafi, whatever we thought about Saddam, they were at least secular leaders of those countries. We deliberately went for regime change there. Would I like to see a continued policy of appeasement and stability with Iran? Well, I have to tell you, actually, if there is a country out there that needs regime change, I think it's Iran. And I meet Iranian expats in this country, in the United States of America, and we can never know the figures. But I would be very surprised if a majority of Iranians did not want their country to go back to being a much more liberal place as it was pre-1979. Boris, I know you're on an aeroplane. You're on your way back after 12 days in Mustique. Raab is out there equivocating. Wallace was Ben Wallace, junior minister, a little bit more supportive of Trump. I think we have to try and make our minds up here. What does Crystal from Acton think? Good morning, Crystal.
Good morning to you. May I start this by saying that whilst I don't agree with your politics at all,
right,
I do respect you for your honesty. Gaddafi did a deal with Obama to get rid of all of his weapons, chemical and likewise. He was then taken out. Suleiman did a deal with Trump to get rid of ISIS, which he did, and then he was taken out. It seems the West is showing the Middle East that they can't be trusted. Do their dirty work, and then you will be exterminated. Why are people saying that it was good to take Suleiman out? He did good. He took ISIS out. What countries, how many countries, you tell me, Nigel, has Iran invaded opposed to the 200 that the USA have invaded?
Well, I think, Crystal, first thing to say is to try and pick who are the good guys and who are the bad guys amongst some of these.
I'll do it.
I think that's actually rather difficult. And whilst ISIS are appalling in every way, and I'm sure we'd agree on that. Who created
ISIS?
You know, well,
who created ISIS?
Well, there are lots of arguments about that, and you know, did the invasion of Iraq?
Be honest, Nigel. That's one thing that you're fantastic at. Be honest. Who created ISIS? Who funded ISIS? Who benefited from ISIS being there?
Crystal, you're right about the American history in this. And look, I think the Iraq War was a massive mistake. I think the war in Libya was a massive mistake. I've never ever changed my view on any of this, but on the Iranian regime, Crystal, they are still brutal and awful and fundamentalist and dangerous.
Excuse me, you've missed a really, really big point. How many countries has Iran invaded? How many, civilians have they killed?
Well, actually,
how many countries has America invaded? 200 countries, Nigel. Be honest about this now.
Crystal, I'm not.
Who is the aggressor here?
Yeah, I am not discussing NATO. I'm not discussing America. I'm not discussing us in this context.
We're discussing Suleiman, yes?
But what we're discussing, what we are discussing,
eliminated by
the
Americans.
He was. Do you think
after they did a deal and Suleiman and his people took out ISIS for the Americans, then Trump is putting up his hand and saying how fantastic I am for taking out ISIS. No, you didn't do it. You did a deal with Suleiman, and that's how it came about.
Crystal, let me ask.
Do you know what really annoys me as well, Nigel?
Yeah.
I've got a child. I mean, and I've got people that I love in this world. I've got people that I respect. I've got colleagues. I don't want to. They're the ones that are going to be at the tail end of the aggression of the Iranians, because they're not going to discriminate. They're not going after Trump.
Do you accept, Crystal, that prior to Trump doing this, the Iranians have been behaving increasingly in a dangerous way, spreading through Hamas, Hezbollah, their funding for all these groups, spreading
you can't say things like that to me, Nigel. That won't wash, because what I've found is that the Iranians, all of those people in the Middle East, only react to the Americans' aggression.
So it's all the Americans' fault, everything?
Not everything, but they have reacted to the Americans' aggression. They took out ISIS because they did a deal with America. And the thing is, they've got bunkers that they're going to go to.
Crystal, let me ask you one.
When this really does kick off,
let me ask you a question, Crystal.
It's the poor civilians that are going to really be at the brunt of it all.
Crystal, let me ask you a question, Crystal. Let me ask you a question.
How do you feel about not getting the
No, it's very difficult to get quiet. Let me ask you a quick question. Quick answer, please.
Yeah.
Do you think Iran would be better off with a much more liberal regime than the current one?
How dare you? It's not up to you. Here you're talking about democracy and the Labour Party not accepting the vote that went through regarding Brexit, and then you're trying to dictate what another
Crystal,
person should do in their country. How very dare you?
If you support a regime that behead people, that crucify people, that treat all sorts of minorities in the most barbaric and appalling way, that's up to you. It's not for me. You're listening to a Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and the time is now 16 minutes past 11.
Is LBC, the Nigel Farage Show. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage on LBC.
Now, quite a remarkable ruling took place at the end of last week that I thought I might just comment on, and it's to do with veganism. Now, there are some, of course, encouraging us all to go vegan in January. I have a little bit of trouble really understanding why anybody would want to do this. I do absolutely understand why people are vegetarian. I do understand why some people just don't want to eat meat. I don't get it myself, but I do understand if that's how people feel, and why some are pescatarians. I understand that as well. But going vegan strikes me as being pretty unnatural, pretty odd. almost a little bit freakish. That's what I think about it. I mean, do what you like. Fine. But for goodness sake, don't try and impose your views upon me. And yet, an employment tribunal discussed this last Friday because a guy called Jordi Casamajana, he was sacked by the League Against Cruel Sports after protesting that some of their pension fund was being invested into companies that had been involved in animal testing, and it led to this big tribunal. Now, Casamajana calls himself an ethical vegan. And the Employment Tribunal has ruled that ethical veganism is a philosophical belief and is therefore protected by law. Now, this same man, who he may be ethical, he probably thinks of himself as a liberal, but he's deeply illiberal, has said he would never have a relationship with anyone that wasn't a vegan, so clearly has some level, as he sees it, of moral superiority over the rest of the world. And I just wonder if this is now protected in law, ethical veganism. If I was to say that I thought this man was deeply intolerant, clearly very unpleasant, pursuing a philosophy that is freakish, wrong, and against nature, I wonder if I was to say that, would that mean that I was now veganist? Just the same as being sexist or racist. If it's protected in law, I really am beginning to wonder whether I'm allowed to say anything that this man finds insulting. In fact, I wonder if we go down this route of everybody being wrapped in cotton wool, everybody being protected from offending opinions, whether we will be able to have any proper debate in the future at all. Veganism is not for me. I think I should be able to criticise it and its adherents without being threatened in any way by the law. Please do text to 84850 if you are a vegan. Tell me, should I be able to criticise people like this? Right, now, we're going to go to, the University of Tehran. Yet we really are. And speak to Professor Saeed Mohammed Marandi. Good afternoon to you, Professor.
Good afternoon, Nigel.
Good afternoon. So, tell me, what is the view from the University of Tehran of Donald Trump's behaviour a couple of days ago?
Well, I don't know about the University of Tehran, but at a personal capacity, I think it's quite outrageous. He committed a war crime against high-ranking Iranian officials, as well as high-ranking Iraqi officials. And the strike was carried out without the consent of the Iraqi government. In fact, just a couple of days before, the U.S. carried out a strike against Iraqi soldiers in the front lines against ISIS, and the Prime Minister of Iraq told the Americans not to do it. The U.S. Secretary of State ignored him as if this was some sort of part of the U.S. empire. And then when the Iraqi Prime Minister asked for him to give evidence that this group from the military force that's fighting ISIS, that they carried out an attack on an American base, he refused to give that intelligence. Why? Obviously because they didn't have such intelligence. So when the American government attacks Iraq and Iraqis and Iranians inside Iraq without the consent of the government, in violation of international law, how do you think Iran should react? Now, the Iranians are outraged.
You talk about, and the very large numbers of people are in the streets today. I saw the pictures of the coffin going through the streets and huge crowds there. And so there's no doubt that there are people in Iran, of course, who do support this regime and who are outraged by this attack. But, you talked about Donald Trump and war crimes. I mean, how many Iranian civilians who were part of the uprising against this regime were put down and killed by the Iranian regime last week?
Well, Nigel, by using the term regime, and repeatedly, you don't legitimize the act of your friend in the White House.
Forget I tell you what. Forget Donald Trump. Forget Donald Trump.
Listen.
I'm doing my best.
Putting down people. You use the word "putting down" as if they're dogs and that people are treated like dogs. That's the language of propaganda.
All right, killed
in Iran.
Killed. All right, let's just use killed, shall we? How many were killed last week?
I don't know the numbers, but what I do know that in that 2011. And when you had riots in the UK, I think it was 2011.
It was in London, particularly.
5 people were killed, and when foreign media, Persian language media channels based in the UK are encouraging people to riot in Iran, and when MEK terrorist organization, the MEK terrorist organization that fought alongside Saddam Hussein, and which is now based in Europe as well as in Albania. When they carry out armed attacks inside Iran during those days, people are going to get killed. So
I'm sorry, Professor. I'm sorry. I mean, the 2011 summer riots that took place in London and some other cities, in which a few people did get killed. That's true. A handful basically got killed, and it wasn't very pretty. But there's no comparison between that and 1,500 people reportedly being killed in the last couple of weeks in Iran for standing up against this theocracy. There's no comparison between the
two. Come on, Nigel. First of all, your numbers are just made up. Second of all, you're right. You can't compare them. Because in the case of the UK, no foreign power is egging on riots. No foreign power is funding groups to carry out attacks. But in the case of Iran, your government facilitates anti-Iranian propaganda. It facilitates TV channels in Persian to encourage rioting. And your government allows terrorists, the MEK terrorists who fought for Saddam Hussein, for them to carry out attacks inside Iran. So you're right, there is no comparison.
Do you genuinely believe?
Since you look at the world from a position of privilege and exceptionalism, you think that if your country interferes in my country's affairs, it's fine. But if God forbid, my country interfered in your country's affairs, the world would
I think Iran has been interfering in the affairs of other countries all around the region, and indeed we've had confrontations between Iranian ships and British ships. So this is not this has not exactly been a happy relationship for a very, very long time. Can I ask you,
Nigel,
do you genuinely believe?
Ship that was taken.
Do you genuinely believe?
It was an Iranian ship that was taken by the British government.
Because of sanctions breaking. Because of sanctions breaking.
No, your government obeys the United States. What sanctions? Those are U.S. sanctions,
actually, Professor, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
The white man sanctions?
I'm sorry, you're wrong. These were EU sanctions. Let me ask you a question. You're there. No, they were EU sanctions. They were EU sanctions.
We could talk about that ship in detail. I know the exact details of what happened. We know that the acting Spanish foreign minister at that time, he said that the Americans ordered this to happen.
Can I ask you a question?
Go look it up.
Can I ask you a question? Do you, as a professor, at the University of Tehran, do you have full academic independence? Are you free to say pretty much whatever you think?
Yeah, I have colleagues in Iran at the University of Tehran who are very much opposed to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they have Twitter accounts. You've never been to Iran, Nigel.
No, I haven't.
You listen to your friends, and you have this distorted view of the world, and you think that that Iran is this mysterious and dangerous place. No, it's a normal country with normal people. But your government, and especially the United States, is abnormal.
Well, before 1979...
it's normal. Your government is behaving abnormally.
Professor, before 79, Iran was a great country. Iran was a great country.
Iran is a great country. Your government has helped the United States and Saudi Arabia and others together to create the extremism that we see in Syria. Trump himself, your friend Trump, he admitted that the United States helped create ISIS.
Professor, where I would agree with you, I tell you what, where I will agree with you is that many of the interventions that have happened in the latter part of the last and the earlier part of this century, spearheaded by the British and the Americans, were mistakes. On that point of agreement,
these are not mistakes; these are war crimes.
On that one point of agreement, I will say thank you very much for joining us here on LBC. And when I've debated Iran before, we've had telephone calls coming into the show from Tehran, from people telling us what an absolutely marvellous country it is to live in. I don't believe a word of it. I think it's a bad regime. I think it was a great country. I think it could be a great country again. I hope indeed one day before too long it is. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and the time is 11:45.
Visit which.co.uk.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC, the Nigel Farage Show.
I think with some confidence I can say that was a vigorous debate with the professor from Tehran University, and exactly as I would have expected it to be. Boris Johnson back from 12 days on Mustique, and we have this big international row going on. Some think what has happened could even precipitate a war. The thought that Trump on his own doing this is the most outrageous, appalling act, and that the Iranians are great people. I don't think anyone seriously believes that. The question really here is, can we appease the Iranian regime? Can we work with them? Is the deal that Obama and the European Union did the right one, or is Trump right to call foul and say, look, actually, they've broken all of these terms. They've used the freeing up of money to back terrorism, to behave appallingly right across this region. These guys are effectively the enemy, and unless they start playing fair, we're going to be very, very, very tough on them. I have to say, I've never believed in the Iran nuclear deal. I never thought they'd hold to the terms of it. I think this is a very, very bad regime. But look, no politics in this part of the world is ever easy. Let's go to Morris in Edgware. Good morning, Morris.
Good morning to you, Nigel. All the best for 2020, whatever it brings.
Kind of you. Thank you. So what does Boris do? Does he back the European Union line and our official foreign policy, or does he say Trump's got a point here?
Well, whatever happens, we've got to get rid of these tyrants, whoever they are, or troublemakers. Get rid of the bullies of the world. In other words, back in the 30s, when the tyrant from Austria, who couldn't hack it there, went to Germany, it was known what he had in his mind. Should have got rid of him. Many, many years later, what happens in Zimbabwe? Mugabe. He carries on living. They should have got rid of him. No, can't get rid of the rubbish, the real troublemakers, those who want to bring peace and all. Oh, it's all right to bump them off or get other people to bump them off. Then we come to this fella. And it was interesting, I just read something from a newspaper here, that this Soleimani, what did he say? He says he could always remain a simple soldier serving Iran in the Islamic Revolution. Well, of course, with his front man, the Ayatollah al-Khamenei, it didn't matter to him because he would no doubt rule over him as well. When is the United Nations, when are they going to start bringing to bear on all these people who would upset everyone in the world? You mentioned you talked to Iranis, and you can, all sorts of people who want to live in decent way of lives. And what are all these people who are causing trouble in the Middle East, what are they actually doing for their people?
Well, Morris, I think the answer to that is that, that Soleimani himself, self-described as being part of the Islamic Revolution, all right? And that to me is the driving force, has been the driving force for now 40 years behind this Iranian regime. We're dealing here with an ideology, not, a country normally behaving in a rational way. It's a real problem. Morris, I'm going to move on. I've got loads of people want to have a say on this. Richard is calling from Abbey Wood. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Nigel. I would say Happy New Year. Well, what's the point? I mean, what a mess. I mean, haven't we not learned our lesson? I mean, with Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, are we just going to be America's lapdog every single time they want to go to war?
Well, Richard, let's just say that Donald Trump is not naturally an interventionist president, that John Bolton, who was there in the White House and resigned because Trump did not want to intervene more in the Middle East, in Iran and countries like this. So Trump's first instinct is not to go to war. What you saw last week was the compound of the American embassy being invaded, and if you believe what Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, and what Donald Trump tell you, they believe they had intelligence that more horrible attacks were planned and that they'd take out the architect. It's slightly different to military invasion, Richard, isn't it?
Yes, I know, but difference from his speech, though, saying that we're not going into a war. Difference is that was scripted. Someone wrote that for him. 5 minutes later on Twitter, we've got big shiny new weapons. We're going to take over to Iran. Who does that? And I'm a young person. I'm 21. We are going to be, my people, like my age, are going to be fighting this war over a politician's mistake. I've got a brother in the army right now, and he's saying that they're briefing about to be sent out. I don't want to lose him. Nigel, your father, how would you feel if your children got drafted? You're saying that, yes, Iran should have a regime change. But what if your children are lying?
Look, Richard, look. The last thing I want is for us to be involved in any war, all right? Let's be absolutely clear about that. But I have to say that the Iranian regime's behaviour gets worse and worse and worse. And here's the only good thing I can say in this circumstance is that I don't think there's any threat of a huge global conflagration because Iran simply isn't strong enough, Richard.
Yes, but that doesn't matter if they're not strong enough. They're extremists, Nigel.
They are.
They're not going to back. They're not going to back down from this, no matter if they know it's all going to go wrong. They are not going to lose faith.
Richard, you sound quite. You sound quite depressed about all of this.
Well, I am depressed. Yeah, because I know. Trump, he will not back down. Iran will not back down. So if Iran attacks the US bases or any allied bases, Trump will go off on one. Honestly, I think this is about to become World War III.
I don't, Richard. I have to say, I really, 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 really don't. But let me ask you this, Richard. Here we've got this theocratic, fanatical, ideological regime that has been in place for 40 years, that has held Iran back in the most extraordinary way, a very, very talented, a country full of very talented people, has always been my experience of it, being destroyed by their own regime, and who increasingly are spreading their poison around the rest of the region and beginning to affect everybody, international trade as well. Are we just, Richard, to stand back and let these guys get away with it?
No, absolutely not. I know this guy is almost as bad as it. he's killed his own people. He's killed thousands of civilians, mostly Muslims as well, his own people. Honestly, it's yes, get rid of him. But if Donald Trump doesn't learn restraints, we will be going into war next term. I'm a patriot. I believe in the UK-US relationship. But at this point, I think it's just a one-way thing where we serve them and we get nothing back. The whole point of leaving the EU was for us to determine what we do. We make our own decisions.
Well, isn't this the point I'm making, Richard, is that actually, William Hague, in that government that began with Cameron as leader in 2010, William Hague making it clear that in many areas of foreign policy, the UK would not have its own policy. We would do these things as part of the European Union. And whether you agree with it or not, the EU are still, Macron particularly, sticking to the line that the Iran nuclear deal is the right deal. I want us to make our own decisions. You do too.
I didn't vote, but people were saying that Brexit would make our own decisions. But do you think that Boris is? Honestly, I think Boris has already backed Trump. I think he's so desperate for a trade deal with the US, he'll send us into a war with Iran if it happens.
Well, I don't think that Donald Trump wants a war with Iran, and I think that Donald Trump thinks that the more he threatens, the more he threatens, the less chance there is of Iran doing anything silly.
I mean, I see the point there, Nigel, but I'm just seriously worried because, yes, that may happen with normal people, but Iran isn't normal. If they keep seeing Donald Trump poking fun of them, antagonising them, they are going to act.
Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. I hope that it's not. And I hope that your absolutely worst fears, and they clearly are very, very worst fears, do not come true. But there you are. Some people clearly are very, very worried about it. Thank you. So look, it's 2020. It is a brand new year. I honestly don't know. I really, really don't know where this particular conflagration is growing. What I do know is that for me, as somebody who's spent a huge part of his life campaigning for us to leave the European Union, which looked very much against the odds, I think that there is something to celebrate on the 31st of January. We will be leaving. Legally leaving, yep, sure, we'll be stuck in transition. Yep, sure, there'll be all sorts of arguments leading up to July the 1st and whether we extend or not, or whether we do actually leave on whatever terms at the end of December 2020. But I think the end of this month is a big moment, and I think you're beginning to see from Alastair Campbell this morning, you're beginning to see from Gary Lineker and others, an acceptance that this is happening. And I think that whilst there'll be a strong argument that says post-Brexit everybody will try and get what they see as the right deal going forward, I think politically those that are seen not to accept Brexit and to go on opposing it will become a diminishing and increasingly, I think, ignored minority. That's enough from me. I will be back with you again tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock, at 3 o'clock this afternoon. It's Ian Payne, but right now, it's Martin Stanford.
Nigel, thank you. We'll continue the conversation about the fallout after the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. President Donald Trump warning the Iranians not to retaliate over the killing.